This is meant to be a bit more of an intermediate level billing workflow. If you're new to Workamajig or you're new to billing, that's not to say you won't get any value out of this. I just want you to know for some of the entry level pieces for Workamajig and for billing, we're going to be kind of going through those relatively quickly, just as they pertain to kind of feeding information into billing workflows. So specifically, I wanted to make this more of a kind of a billing cycle based webinar here, just kind of what you need to do to set up the system here to have kind of fluid billing workflows from month to month. The start for this, I'm going to kind of quickly go into some system setup, client, and project level pieces. But the goal here is to kind of get you to a place where you can use this billing screen, the Today billing screen in particular here, and use one of the workflows that we have set up on this page, where we can kind of feed information here from the clients and projects in that setup. So primarily, we're going to be looking at both billing worksheets as well as the mass billing tools. These are kind of two different paths for your workflow billing here. Excuse me. And the start for these here, I want to look at both system setup and, like I said, the client record. So we're going to go ahead and jump into system setup here to start. Now, some of this are going to be things that you would typically set up at the beginning of your time with Workamajig. When we first kind of take you through training and deployment, some of these items may be familiar to you. If you join the agency after this had already been done, this will probably be a pretty good refresher for you. But specifically, there's a couple of items in here I want to point out that pertain to billing workflows and just kind of the billing setup in the system in general. So obviously, billing options are the first place that we want to go here. One of the most important setup pieces in Workamajig in general, but especially as it pertains to billing here, are your services. You're probably familiar with these. These kind of serve a double duty. They will be used by your project managers for assignments, both at a template and a live project level here. But services can also be used to set the specific sales account that these are going to that these would post to. So, right, this is basically what your team would do. I'm an account manager, I'm a copywriter, I'm a graphic designer, and those are the kind of items we need on the schedule for a project. We can also set what the standard hourly rate is here for these services. Now, this, again, is just what your standard rate is. If you do have client-specific or situationally specific rate sheets, we have another area where you can set those up. But this area here kind of determines kind of what services are available, what they would bill at, and what the sales account for these would be. Now, my list here, if you're following along on your own site, or if you go and look later, my list here has been adjusted to add things like the billing item, the tax applications, things like that. That is also something that can be set at a service level, right? Whether tax would apply to a specific service. This is kind of a whole workflow setup as well, kind of requires a few pieces set both in system setup and at the client level for these to flow through properly. But this is kind of one of the starting places, right? Saying whether or not a tax rate would apply to the service. Then you can also see things like department if you use those in your system, or billing item. Now, billing items are a way to group this detail on an invoice. So for services in Workamajig, when we bill these here, we can display all the way down to the service level saying, hey, it was copywriting, I'm billing you X number of dollars for it on this project here. Or you could use something like a billing item to group that information together. So instead of saying, art design and copy and creative direction, I can kind of group all of those and just show a services line, a professional services line, or however you want to define these on your invoice. At any rate, those services are kind of the starting place for this. Whether you're billing time and materials or fixed fee, this will set either the budget amount on a fixed fee project, right? I need 10 hours of account management. It bills at $125 an hour. Or it will set the actual rates for time and materials transaction, kind of the same thing, right? 10 hours were entered by a user to a project. That's billable at $125 an hour or whatever you set for them. I mentioned that you can also have rate sheets here that's directly underneath services. So you'd want to make sure your services are set to the rates that you typically bill. But for your service rate sheets, again, these can be a client-specific rate sheet, or they can be a situationally specific rate sheet. right? So we could keep, hey, this was our 2023 rates or our 2024 rates, so on and so forth. We could say, hey, these are rates specifically for Acme Incorporated. This is a rush project, so we charge a bit more, something like that. But at the end of the day, these basically, when you create a new one, they'll pull your standard service rates and basically allow you to decide what's different, right? So we can say, okay, for rush rates, we charge, 135 an hour for account management, or under the more button here, you can apply adjustments across the line here. You can say, hey, everything should be, 110% of normal, for example, just a 10% markup on what the standard cost would be for a rush project. So these kind of set the table for your clients as well, right? The rate sheet here can be selected at a client level. These can also be used on specific projects, right? So this project is a rush job. We don't use our standard rates, for example. And additionally, in service setup here, I did want to point over to billing items as well. The list for this is relatively small by default. I believe it's 4 or 5 items, but you can define your own billing items here. This is kind of an optional piece to a billing workflow. Many agencies do not use billing items, and that's perfectly fine. But again, this is a way to say, I would rather not show so much information on my invoice. I do want to show my clients something. I want to show the difference between this was digital, this was production, these were professional services, so on and so forth. But these kind of build the groupings for you. So when you go to, if you want to use billing items or you use them, you typically want to define these first and then put your services in the categories afterwards. You won't see the option for them in the service list until they're defined here. And for billing items, we can set some pieces here, like if you want to post a billing item itself to a specific sales account. This piece here is kind of specific to how you're billing. If you bill a single line on a project, for example, in some cases that would post to one sales account, and others it would post to a bunch of different ones here. But this really would only apply, again, if you want to post the information at a billing item level. And if that doesn't make sense, hopefully it will once we start generating invoices. I'll make at least one here with billing item and item. So you can kind of see the structure that makes for your invoice, what that does from a posting standpoint, and why and when this would be used here. Aside from that, we also want to look at your purchase items. Again, I'm going to kind of quickly gloss over this here, but purchase items would be the outside cost items. Any expense in Workamajig by default would require a purchase item. So basically saying if I'm entering a vendor invoice or a miscellaneous cost, for example, then these are the items I have to choose from to say what specifically I'm buying. You don't necessarily need to go too crazy with these. Office supplies works as a stand-in for number 2 pencils, for example. You may not want to be that specific, but this would basically designate first, anything you'd want specific or unique reporting on, right? So if you don't care about how much you've spent on number 2 pencils overall, more on office supplies, it's probably better just to designate it that way here. And these would apply to both billable items as well as overhead items, right? So we have a default list in the system. Again, your system probably has some of these set up, but if you need new designation for purchase items, this is where you would add them. And purchase items also have a default expense and sales accounts that would be associated with them as well, right? So if I bill this boot camp item out to one of my clients on a client invoice, it'll post to the 4302 account here, or my digital sales account here, and which expense account that this would use on a vendor invoice. I did have a question here regarding the rate sheet. Would you recommend having the standard rate sheet set to 0? Actually, no, your standard rate sheet should be what your standard prices would be, right? So this standard rate sheet here should be what you would typically sign any new client with for the rates. Rate sheets would only be used in situations where you would need something different from that, right? So if I have a client-specific rate sheet, then I'd go ahead and designate that here and then just determine whatever the difference was between the two. Couple of other items here in system setup, and then we're going to go take a look at clients. You do also, under billing options here, have your invoice and estimate layouts and your invoice templates. Now, these are both tools to determine what the printed version of an invoice would look like. you can have differing internal detail versus what you display to a client, both from a line perspective, well, actually entirely from a line perspective. The headers and the footers, those would largely be the same, but basically kind of what level of detail that you would need. And the primary, or one of the major reasons for that would be the posting detail. Right, I may want to post all the way down to the service level, right? I want to show account management goes to its own GL and creative direction goes to its own GL, so on and so forth. But I don't necessarily want to show that level of detail to my clients. In addition to that, it also just affects the aesthetics of what it looks like when you print an invoice from the system. So I typically recommend for my clients to use invoice templates first. This tool is much easier to work with than the layouts tool. It's kind of a standard form that you can adjust according to your needs. And if we take a look at these here, we'll take a look at my detailed invoice template, and you can have as many of these as you need. So if you have specific needs for specific clients, or again, for situations, you can define those. By default, you'll see detailed and summary in here. The settings for mine are a little bit different from the defaults, but taking a peek at these, there's really kind of two major areas to take a look at. Your options and the layout here. The options will really determine kind of what shows, and this is, again, relatively easy. It's just a lot of kind of simple decisions to say, okay, do I want to show, do I want to show my time detail or not? For example, do I want to show expense detail? And if I show either of those two things here, how am I showing it, right? Am I summarizing the time into groups? Am I showing the labor hours, the labor rates? And if you want these things, again, you can kind of just click these checkboxes here to designate that you want them on the invoice. So it separates into line options and the header and footer options. The header and footer would be things like, am I showing the account manager's name? Do I have a client PO number I want to show? Do I want to show a campaign linked to this invoice if that's the case? Things like that. And an important piece of these is the all lines area here, or the line detail area here. All lines basically means any line I have on an internal invoice, I also want to print on the client-facing invoice. But there are a few other options for this, either all summary lines, which is kind of probably the second most popular of these, or top level lines. This basically says if I have an invoice that goes 3 or 4 different levels deep, from a summary line standpoint, to only print the very top level of those summaries. So again, all lines is everything. All summary lines would typically be only the bolded lines when we're printing this out to the client from a detail standpoint. And the layout tab here would determine kind of some of the aesthetics of the invoice. So this is where you would upload your logo right here in this area. This should typically be 1x4 to fit the tool properly without being sized or getting pixely or stretched or any of those different things here. There's a lot of options here regarding which address you want from your company printed on an invoice, or whether or not you want that printed in the first place. If you want to show things like the invoice number, the invoice date, and all the way here at the bottom, we have the fonts for the invoice. Excuse me. This allows you, of course, to control which fonts are displayed in different sections of the invoice, the size of those fonts, and whether you want them bold or italicized. Now, when working with layouts or templates, I typically recommend opening 2 tabs, one for your template so you can adjust it just like I'm doing here, and one with an invoice that you can test with. Either it's an invoice you've already printed and you're just kind of looking at the aesthetics of it if you change the template, or one that you've made as a test. That way, when you make changes on this side here, for example, in the options, or if you move any of these pieces here, if you want to adjust where your client address prints, you can save the changes to the template here and just reprint your invoice to make sure it matches kind of what you're looking for, if you want to revert it back to what it was before. All right, I have a few questions here, and then we'll take a look at invoice layouts quickly. There's a question here regarding, is there any way to have a kind of subcategory for item IDs? Like travel is the item, but air, hotel, and rental car fits under the actual line item details. Yeah, actually, that is a situation for billing items, right? I could have a billing item for travel, for example, and then I could have either services or purchase items that use that billing item, right? So my team may have billed air, hotel, rental car on an expense report, or on a credit card charge, or a vendor invoice, something like that. But I could just display to the client a list that says travel. That's exactly what you would use these billing items for. So again, the structure would be you define them here, and then when you're looking at your services or when you're looking at your purchase items, you could fill in that billing item on this list afterwards. There's this one here, right? So basically saying if I use any of these media items I have here, cable, internet, outdoor, if I use and print an invoice with billing item and item, it will display media as the billing item, and that might be just what I showed the client. And then another question here, can we use the estimate using the billing item? You can actually. The estimate itself, when you're building it, won't show the billing item. But again, when you're invoicing that detail from the estimate, we can reference the billing item associated with what you've built with and have the invoice created accordingly. Now back on the topic of kind of the printed version of your invoices, invoice and estimate layouts is the other tool here. Again, I would recommend starting with templates. You're just typically this is a 5 or 10 minute process to get these set up. They're pretty easy. Invoice and estimate layouts are a bit more involved. There's a lot to them. Now we have webinars specifically on this tool, so there's a lot to it, but I at least kind of want to show you how it works here. These work for both invoices and estimates. They're kind of 2-in-1. So whenever you look at one of the options in here, it's going to have both sides, invoice and estimate, in the layout itself. And if I look at my one project summary, for example, you'll see that this is basically more of a design-based tool. You'll have a number of components over here that you can pull out into your invoice or estimate layout. The structure for this, the printed structure for this will match exactly what we see here. You'll see this is kind of actually designed like a printed piece of paper. If I zoom a little bit into this here, which is something I guarantee you're going to want to do, if you're working with these, we can see there are some fields here that just have text, like my invoice number field here. This will print exactly as displayed without the border I have here. And we'll have some fields with this ampersand. This is saying reference what's on the actual invoice itself to give me the invoice number, date, and due date, right? So this keeps it flexible. And this will either look at the invoice detail or at the client to pull that information, things like our client name or billing address, things like that. And again, this tool is pretty extensive, so I would definitely feel free to reach out if you want to use these, or if you're struggling with them. Again, we have some resources to kind of take you through how they work here. But this is really kind of designed to be more of a design-based tool, with the idea basically that you give this to a creative or somebody and say, hey, make our invoices a little bit pretty with these kind of specific direction pieces. And have them print out. So the header and footer of these are relatively pretty easy. This will kind of print exactly as displayed. Where they get a little bit tricky is in the detail lines. This is basically generated one time each time there's a line on your invoice. Just note that that's the case here. Anything you put in detail can be printed once if you have a single line, or 10 times if you have 10 lines. So it can get a little bit goofy there, but kind of a more flexible tool, obviously, than our template tool here. If you want something a little bit more unique, the layouts are typically where you would go afterwards, or if you have specific needs for specific project types or clients, then again, layouts kind of give you more control over what the printed version of an invoice would look like. Now, the next piece here, before we start getting into your actual mass billing workflows here, is to look at the client level. There's a lot here I find often that my clients or my users don't know about. So I want to point a few of those pieces out here. In Workamajig, everything's kind of designed to flow forward, both from a transactional basis. Your leads become contacts, your opportunities can become projects, things like that. And your clients will feed a lot of information to every project that's opened. So the client itself will feed information to a project, which then feeds information into those mass billing screens. So having these clients' records set up correctly here is kind of a big piece for making sure that you have accurate and consistent billing here in Workamajig. The first tab here is I want to take a look at is project defaults. There's really only one major area here I want to point out, and that is this get labor right from field here. This can be adjusted if you click into the project defaults pencil. You'll see a drop down here. There's a number of different options in this, but we typically recommend using either service or service rate sheet, one of those two different pieces. These are two of the most commonly used ones. Get labor rate from service just basically tells Workamajig when a new project is opened, both when I'm estimating and the actuals. We'll use our standard rates, right? But you can, if we had a client-specific rate sheet, I actually have an old one in here for Acme. So if I tell this to be a service rate sheet, Workamajig will ask me which rate sheet to use. It will go ahead and provide that drop down here, and I can say, oh, this is a pro bono client, or they have their own client-specific rate sheets, things like that. The strength of doing this is that anytime you open a project for this client, this is what your labor rates will be set at. So you don't really have to have your PMs or anyone kind of concerned about when the project opens. It just kind of feeds that information in there. And again, it also determines the rates when you're estimating as well. So if our standard is 125 for account management, but our rate sheet needs to be 135 for this client, it would pick that up so long as I set that here. On the billing side, there's quite a bit in here that we want to look at. This impacts both projects and just straight up billing. So some of these items actually don't live in projects. We pull them directly from the client record when we invoice, especially if you're using mass invoicing. So if you use billing worksheets or if you do mass billing. These defaults here will determine a lot of how the system handles billing for this particular client. Now, some of this is passed to a project, but a lot of it is just used in mass billing. So we'll see at the top here for defaults, you can set what the sales tax rate for a client would be. This is another piece that would typically be defined in system setup first. You'd set what those rates would be, right? We need California rates, or we need, a VAT tax or whatever that is here. And you can tell Workamajig, hey, the rates that would be used for this client are the California rates. Right. And if there's two separate rates here, you have, let's say, a city and a state rate or something like that, or a VAT and a state rate, you could, again, enter both of those pieces here. Again, this is just part of the workflow. We'd want to define those sales taxes first. We'd want to set which services or items would apply to those sales tax pieces. And then finally, we'd want to set what those sales tax pieces are as well. Beneath that here, we have certain things like your default sales account. We are not going to be using this. This would only be used in cases where Workamajig doesn't have better information. So just know that that's the case. Same thing with AR account. We'll typically use your system default for that. So you don't necessarily need to fill either of these two fields in here. Although I believe default sales account will just be filled in automatically for you. And you can see that you have your invoice templates and layouts. This is also very useful for mass billing because this says I don't have to set this manually on each invoice. If we don't have this information here, when you generate an invoice, you just have to tell the system, hey, I want to use the detail template, or I want to use the summary template. And you need to do that each time you generated an invoice for the client. Setting it here kind of standardizes what that would look like. Just kind of always sets those things, and you're not locked to them. Of course, you can still change them if you need, but if Acme typically needs detailed invoice templates, then that's something I should set here. We'll also see the billing method here. Now, the default billing method for any new client in Workamajig is time and materials. And this is probably a good time to mention that we have 3 different options for billing methods: time and materials, fixed fee, and retainer. Those are basically what they sound like. Either we're billing transactions, we're billing the budget, or we're billing a specific regular cycle that's kind of free from transactions. We'll talk through all 3 of these here at some point in this call here. But again, the default is time and materials for any new client in Workamajig. So if Acme Incorporated was typically a fixed fee client, for example, I could set this to fixed fee. And just like your templates, you're not locked to this, right? If I had bill Acme, 90% fixed fee, but occasionally they have a time and materials or retainer project come in, I can still change that for any project or campaign I open for them. This just kind of saves you and your team time by automatically setting for any new project what the billing method would be. So this is a field that does actually feed directly to projects. And then if we scroll down a little bit further here, these options directly apply to mass billing. So when it's asking one invoice per, I've got this set to client for Acme right now. There's a number of different options for this, but the most consistently used ones here are client or project. I would say by far, probably over 90% of our user base uses one of these two options. It's a pretty standard way to group information on invoices. And what this is basically saying is, if I'm invoicing multiple projects and I have this set to one invoice per project, it's going to create one invoice for each one of those jobs, right? This doesn't say that you can only invoice a project once. I've had a lot of people ask me that question. Actually, this just says in the instance I'm billing multiple projects, I want multiple invoices. Or on the flip side, I could say, hey, if I'm billing 3 projects for this client, I want them all on the same invoice. Then following the one invoice per, when we're generating in mass billing here, it's the line detail. So now that I've determined I want one invoice per client, if I'm billing 3 projects, what kind of information am I showing on that invoice? Right. So if it's one invoice per client, I can just say, hey, 3 projects are 3 lines, one for each project with the totals. Or it can be project and task. You can break it out to service or service and item, or you can go project, billing item, then item, right? There's a lot of different options here. And again, this controls both what you see on the invoices when they're generated, because if we're mass billing, we don't kind of go through and individually select those. We kind of want the system to just spit them out the way we want to see them. And it also determines what kind of posting detail you're looking at. Right, for time and materials, we can have a single line post to a whole bunch of different sales accounts, but for fixed fee, we really don't have better information for those, right? So for fixed fee, this is particularly important because one line per project typically means I'm posting all of the revenue from this invoice to a single sales account. If that's how you do things, that's perfectly fine. But if you're a little bit more concerned about where the detail posts based off of the estimate or the actuals, then the one line per will also affect that there. So at a top level, pretty simple, right? Just what we want to see on the one line per. I just wanted to add those special considerations for those situations, just knowing that that's kind of how we would typically post detail is at the line level on an invoice. And you'll notice there's 2 of these here, right? So you could say one line per for time and materials or one line per for fixed fee type invoices. That's perfectly fine. The options here are a little bit different because the information we get for an invoice is a little bit different, but they are largely I think relatively self-explanatory. Just what level of detail are we showing? How many lines are we creating on an invoice when we generate it for this client? And again, remember what you have internally does not have to be what you show to a client. That's what our layouts and our templates are for. We can say, hey, we don't want to show everything. And then of course, your payment terms are down here as well. This is another thing you can set up in system setup. You can set unique payment terms up here. But our defaults are all in here, 15, 30, 45, or due on receipt. And that can be set per client at the client level as well. Okay, so let's look at the mass billing workflows here down. Again, all of this information is passed to a client. So if I go to my projects page here and I look at a few of the projects I've made for this webinar here, I made a number of them so that we can do some mass billing here. But again, if we just look at, we're going to grab the first one on the list here. A lot of the information from those client records are passed into the project settings for your project. And that really kind of impacts how this job would be invoiced and how it would be seen in mass billing. So if you look at those project settings here, first in billing options, this is, again, your labor rates will be here. So since my client Acme here, or this client is set up to get our standard rates, that's what pulls here. This is typically something that you want correct before you start building estimates or kind of messing with the project too much, because again, your estimate rates will be based off of whatever labor rates are set here. So if this should be on a service rate sheet, we can go ahead and set that. And the other piece here is your billing method. Again, this is passed directly from the client to the project, and this definitely matters from a mass billing perspective. We group the projects by their billing method in that screen typically. So again, just want to make sure that this is set correctly before we actually start any of those invoicing or billing cycles here. There are a number of things you can use as additional reporting downflows. Honestly, most of my clients don't use these fields. They would typically be used in reporting. But if we set a billing manager, for example, I could pull up a list and say, I only want to invoice projects that are managed by this billing manager or part of this billing group, just as an example. You will see an option down here for split billing. I'm not going to go too far into this, but again, we can split the cost of this project between multiple clients, or if you have parent companies, for example, with multiple children, you can say, oh, 60% goes to this child of that parent, 40% goes to this one. It'll basically just ask you which client and which percentage of the invoice that they'd be paying here. Again, this is relatively niche. I do have clients that use it, but it's just in those situations if you were invoicing one project that needed to be split between multiple entities. Then the other piece here that you have an option for is the billing schedule. You don't have to use these, but this does allow you to set some timing around how projects are billed. In truth, to me, these make a lot more sense on fixed fee projects, right? I have a fixed fee project. It runs for 6 months. We bill the client $5,000 a month. I could build that into here. And when you set up a line in your billing schedules, it will ask you either for a percentage of the budget to bill or a specific amount to bill, kind of one or the other. And let's just say 25% for this one. And then from there, you can set either a specific date to bill, or you can set it to bill when a specific task is complete. So if you have tasks that would be kind of either revenue milestones for a project that trigger billing, you can kind of use this, and this will just kind of set the date when that's actually done. Or you can say, oh, this project starts to bill on March 1st, and then maybe it bills for the next, looks like 4 months because I did 25%. And the nice thing about doing it this way here is you can duplicate these lines. So I can say we start in March, but this option next to these billing schedules allow you to copy these, right? So I can say, oh, March, April, May, and June, I want 25% of this billed, on the 1st of each month. It will trigger that billing for these, and then that will be picked up in mass billing. This is nice for fixed fee projects because I could have a fixed fee job. Let's say it's like this one, it's a $40,000 job. And Workamajig without a billing schedule doesn't know when you're billing that 40 grand or how you're billing it. So this allows you to have the system kind of pick that up automatically and not have to think about it too much when you're in mass billing. So again, to me, it shines a bit more on the fixed fee side, but you can use it for time and materials for things like creating an advance bill. And then you bill the actuals afterwards. On fixed fee, I typically recommend fleshing out the whole schedule. Don't build, 50% of the build out, what it's going to build the whole thing out here. But again, just allows you to control the timings there. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about project billing at this level here. I, again, wanted this to be largely a workflow-based call here, kind of what the mass billing workflows would look like. But at the project level, your billing information is here. This is kind of how you would bill a project as a one-off piece. You can do this as part of a regular billing cycle. You could say, I open up 30 different projects and bill them individually. But we have built-in pieces in the system that say, okay, now that we have all of this information set at the project level, I've got my project set up for how it's going to bill and what it's going to bill, how I want my invoices laid out, all of those different things. That information is fed to the Billing Today page here. So under billing from the main menu, billing today, we'll see those two major workflows I mentioned earlier, either the mass billing tools here. This kind of separates your projects by the category that you've said, the billing method that you've said they would bill to, excuse me, along with the totals to that period. And this can be adjusted, right? So I could either move this into the past or the future. I could say, hey, we're doing February billing for some reason at the very, very end of the month, or January billing at the end of the month. So I can say everything that was billable as of January 31st. And it will update this list accordingly for you and only pull in time and materials transactions that are equal to or prior to that date. Same thing with fixed fee. If we're using billing schedules, it will pick that up here and say, yep, this wasn't billable as of 1/31, so I'm not going to pull it here. But this would be kind of option one here is the mass billing tools here in Workamajig. And if we look at one of these, if we look at time and materials, for example, it's going to list all of the different projects that can be billed up to this period, right? So it's going to say, hey, the to bill amount was 54,000 and change here. Here's how it arcs out across the projects that you have in the system here currently. And there's quite a bit of good information on the screen for a billing manager or for anyone that's kind of generating these here. It starts with what your budget is on the project. I've been bad, and a lot of these projects don't have budgets, but hopefully yours do. It will show you what has been invoiced on the project to this point. what is to bill on the project to this point, and what the variance against the budget is. So this is negative $1,000 because I have no budget and I've already invoiced some and I have more to bill, right? So it kind of shows you where you're at versus the budget here. Again, pretty handy information to have when you're going through these here. If we look at the top here, you can filter this to a specific client or GL company. If you use those, GL companies are multiple financial entities in the same instance of Workamajig. So if you have multiple wings to your business, this allows you to say, hey, I only want to bill items for company A or company B. And of course, the client would be your client roster. The through date is looking at the through date for the transactions on these projects. So again, this is another area where I can say, whoops, I actually wanted this to only be through January 31st or something to that effect here. And in the individual lines here, if we were actually billing these, I'm going to grab one or two and bill them here in a moment. But before we do that, you can actually click into any of these lines on the time and materials page, and it will take you to the billing tab of that project. So if you need to do any adjustments on these time and materials transactions before you actually invoice this project, for example, if we were just a little bit over, our variance shows, hey, we're about $500 over what the budget was for this. Let's either transfer those or write those off, something like that. I could jump into this project, see all of the different transactions here, and then take actions accordingly before I actually generate an invoice for this. So this one shows I have 3 transactions entered to this project. If I click a checkbox for any of the transactions, it's going to give you additional options up here at the top. And this is where I can say, oh, this transaction should be marked as billed, or it needs to be written off. Maybe it's on the wrong project. I can transfer it from this one to another one. Again, all these things that you can do before you actually go to create an invoice for this. Additionally, you can click into the details here. You can do things like adjust the gross or the rate for these. I typically recommend not doing this unless it's something small, right? I want to round this out to a nice even number or something to that effect. But you can add comments to these or split an entry, right? Either split a time entry or split an invoice line to say, oh, this actually should be partially billed on another project or something to that effect. Or maybe you only want to write off half of the transaction. You could split it and then write off the other half of the transaction, for example. So those are basically the things that you could do here on the time and materials screen to kind of pull some of this information in. There is a list here of 3 dots on the right-hand side that allow you some additional filter options, as well as kind of determining what you want to bill. By default, we bill only time and expenses, but you can, for example, pre-bill orders. If that's part of your process, you can have that picked up and billed as part of these time and materials invoices. And then again, just some filter options. So if you only want to build projects for a certain account manager or for a certain office, something like that, you can filter those here as well, kind of do them in blocks. But let's go ahead and bill a couple of these. Let's bill these 2 projects and this one here. I want 2 on the same client here at the very least. So we're billing 3 different projects here. Workamajig by default is going to assume the to bill amount here is what you're going to bill. So just know that when you click those checkboxes and you say, I want to generate these invoices, it's billing to this amount for these clients. It may group multiple projects on the same invoices. If you remember, we have our 1 invoice per option. So Aperture, this client right here, may just have 1 invoice with 2 different projects on it. And the line detail will be based off of what we had set in system setup. So if we click to generate these here, Workamajig will slide out your billing options for the mass billing piece here, allow you to set your invoice date. You can create these as approved, right? So if they don't need to go to an account manager or to finance, for example, for approval before they're sent to the client, you can say, let's just skip that step here. I'm going to leave these as unapproved for now to show you what the option is here. And at this point, you can tell Workamajig that you want a specific setup for your 1 invoice per and your 1 line item per as well. The mass billing, let's see here. Actually, it doesn't look like there is here currently. I did have a couple of questions here regarding if you have a billing schedule set and an invoice gets generated outside of mass billing, the billing continues to show up in mass billing as something still to generate. Typically, the system should actually link those, but yeah, oftentimes you would want to bill through either the project billing or one of these 2 options, the mass or billing worksheets, because unless it matches up with the detail of the schedule exactly, we can't really map the invoice that you've generated to that schedule. right? So if I had a billing schedule for one of these lines here, if it was fixed fee or something like that, Workamajig would automatically show at the project level that that line of the schedule has been billed, and it would show you which invoice it is. But if you created one outside of the billing schedule and it's not linked to the project, there's really no way to kind of retroactively bring the two together. That's done at the point that they're generated. And then I had another user ask, is there not a way to filter mass billing by billing manager? And you know what? It actually doesn't look like there is right now. That is a good suggestion for future updates to this. But honestly, we don't have huge usage for that tool currently, so I'm guessing no one's asked to this point. But that's a very good suggestion. I'll pass that over to our development team. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and generate these three invoices here for time and materials. What I do, again, it's going to ask me for this detail here. I'm going to go ahead and generate these invoices. And since we're mass billing, Workamajig is not going to pop the invoice or these invoices out for you automatically. What it's going to do is just clear them from the list. And when I close this page here, we'll see in the invoices workflow, I intended to clear this so it makes it a little bit more clear here, but the invoices we just created from the mass billing here feed into the invoice list here, right? And that actually also works for billing worksheets, which we'll see in a moment. This basically says, hey, these invoices need some kind of attention somewhere along the process. And there's really three statuses for your invoices. Either they're waiting to be submitted. All the invoices we just created are going to be in this list, right? It says they haven't been submitted. They've just been created at this point. Those will send to your default approver here in the system. Either once they've been submitted, they will be waiting for approval. This will show you a big list of invoices that are waiting for approval, of course, and who the approver for them are. And once they've been approved, the system says, hey, they either need to be printed or emailed. This is kind of the last step, right? So it's been submitted, it's been approved, but if we want the client to pay it, we should probably show it to them at some point here. That's what this list does here. So the invoices list doesn't keep a list of all the invoices you've ever had. This just shows you where the open invoices are currently at from a status standpoint in your system. Once they've been cleared through the invoices to print or email, if you need to see an older invoice or pull it up again, you'd want to use the view for client invoices here to find those. But the invoices that kind of need some attention at some point would be in this list. So ideally, at the end of a billing cycle, this list would be completely empty. You'd just see nothing under this invoices list. But if we look at our waiting to be submitted, we'll see the invoices that we just created here on this list. Again, these can be submitted in mass. This is just a page for you to see for the client who the approver is on these specific invoices. And hopefully this isn't confusing, but I have a user in my system named account manager. So this isn't a blanket option you can select. But it's basically saying, hey, this is the name of the person that needs to approve these, the invoice total, and then any other details. Is there a project or a campaign number for this, for example? And once these have been submitted, they'll go through to the next step of the process, right? So I can go ahead and submit all of these invoices. When we look at our invoices waiting for approval here, that will have been updated to this. And again, kind of shows you a lot of the same information, just a different set of, a different status for these. And this is actually a page where if you have the ability to approve invoices, so a lot of these I am the approver on, I can kind of click through a whole bunch of these. You can approve these on both this and the previous page. You can click into the invoice itself to see the invoice to make sure the details are correct. If you need to add things like an invoice comment or adjust the posting date, for example, you can do that. And you can also print this from here as well. My invoice is going to be pretty ugly. My layouts are all goofy right now. But again, you can see that, hey, this is not going to work. We need our logo fixed. The line detail isn't going to work, just as an example. So from here, I can either approve this or reject it back to the submitter. You typically see a rejection option. And if you do have to reject, you can provide the details in some text comments about what needs to be changed specifically before this can be approved. Your invoices can't be posted till they're approved, but again, they can be approved in mass from here. You can say, you know what, these particular invoices, let's go ahead and approve those, and it will update the list here for you. Jennifer's asking a question about how the billing manager factors into mass billing. Billing manager is really just a filter option. It allows you in things like billing worksheets to set who the worksheet would go to. It typically go to the account manager. There's a couple of different functionality pieces for them. But again, if you're not using it, you won't really see an impact for it. And there's no requirement to use billing manager as part of the billing workflows. And again, last piece here for the invoices workflow are the invoices to print or email. Again, this is a list of all of your approved invoices that haven't been either printed or emailed from the system. I have a whole bunch of these backlogs. Some of them are pretty old at this point, but again, I can grab multiples of these and I can either print them or mark them as printed. And you'll notice in the upper right-hand corner, you have a tab to change from print to email. So if you want to email these out of the system, Workamajig can email them to the contact email on the list here. Know that this function will only work for a invoice where we have a contact that also has an email address that we know where to send this to, right? So this one would be fine, but this invoice, for example, has no contact email. It's just not going to show in that list. So that's kind of how those would work there. And so again, just like everything else on this screen, these are meant to be done in mass. So I can either print these in mass, I could grab all 5 of these projects and say, let's go ahead and print them. Workamajig is going to go ahead and pull out a PDF of my very lovely invoice template here that needs fixing. It will show you all of those different invoices that you've printed, and it would clear them from this list. Now, if you do need to reprint an invoice for any reason, again, you can go find it in views, but they will by default clear off of this list after they've been printed or emailed one time. And you'll actually see in an invoice, if we look in the details, these options down here are the ones that clear it from the queue. So if you print it, we just check this, or if you email it, we check this, and that's kind of what keeps it from being on that invoices to print or email listing. Okay, so that's the invoices workflow here. That is the to bill mass billing workflow. Know that there are other options in here. Again, you do have fixed fee. For example, when we take a look at this here on the fixed fee side, the options are very similar to what you'd see for time and materials, but obviously we're billing a different fashion. So the budget is very important on this side here. For a fixed fee, you will not have a project show up in this list if it does not have a budget. And additionally, it will also typically drop off of this list if the budget has been billed in full. The exception to that would be if you have things like unbilled billing schedule lines on your projects, for example. But for fixed fee here, if you click into the line, you can change some of the details here for this. So for example, we can say we want to bill as a percentage of total. This is typically, or excuse me, the remaining, that's typically what you'd want to do here. You could do either of those two, but that's just telling this field, what are we determining, either the budget or the remaining billable here. You can change the percentage to bill. Again, this would typically be 100 if we don't have a billing schedule, and then you can adjust it from there to say, oh, we want to bill 25%. Or instead of doing this, you could say, oh, we need to bill a flat 1,200. Right? Either one of these two fields will work. Either you can use the percentage to get the to bill amount, or you can enter in the to bill amount and Workamajig will calculate the percentage of it from there. We'll also show you if you have an advance bill that this can be applied against. In Workamajig, advance bills are invoices that you can create as a bill before a project start or before you've done a certain amount of work. Those invoices will post to an accrual account. They will not post to revenue straight away. And your advanced bill invoices will require at least one more revenue invoice to recognize it, right? So if I build 5,000 as an advance here, I can kind of keep applying invoices to this until those funds have been exhausted here. And it's at the point that I create a revenue invoice and apply it to the advance that we recognize the revenue according to what's on that revenue invoice that you create. Yeah, so you can kind of create all of these different pieces here. Can generate invoices for multiple fixed fee projects. Again, just like time and materials, we can make adjustments. This is less making adjustments at the transaction level and more at the what I'm actually billing level here. You can create advanced bills here. Again, this will tell Workamajig to post all of the revenue to an accrual account. If you're not familiar with this process, I would definitely recommend kind of either chatting with your account manager or reading through some of our documentation before you do that here. But again, I can kind of build multiple projects in here, these 3, for example, and say, okay, I want to generate these and get kind of a similar listing that we saw on the time and material side. Just in this instance, for the line detail, it's going to use what it's found on your budget of the project for the detail, right? So when it says, hey, I'm billing service and item, for example, it's not looking at the actuals of what's entered. It's looking at the detail of what's on the budget of that project. Okay, so I do want to kind of wrap up with billing worksheets here. This is our other major billing workflow in Workamajig. And just to be clear here, you typically choose one of these two processes. Most agencies wouldn't use both as part of their billing cycles. And the determination here is kind of what your billing workflow looks like between you and the account or project manager on those projects. So billing worksheets basically sends a worksheet to the account manager on the project to say, okay, what's billable on this project in this billing cycle period? And that works for both time and materials and fixed fee. It basically is going to kind of pull up what the billable amount is for those. And again, allow them to kind of make adjustments to them. And then once they finished with that worksheet, they would send it back to the approver. They'd say, yep, this is what I want to bill. And that approver could sign off on that and then create an invoice for it. So either of these two workflows, we're going to end up down here, right? Either it starts here or it starts here, but at the end of the day, we get here. But the major difference between billing worksheets is we have that extra step in the process. This basically says, okay, I typically would have a communication piece with the account manager, kind of a worksheet I send to them to have them let me know what to bill. And when you click to generate these here, again, this isn't generating an invoice. It's just saying, hey, we're making a worksheet for this project. It will lock out the billing for that project until this worksheet is completed, basically assuming the worksheet's going to contain the detail of what's going to be invoiced. That way, we're not hitting a moving target if new stuff comes into the project at that point. And when you generate these, it kind of asks you a similar question to the date piece here for mass billing. What is the through date for the transactions that we have here? What is the due date that I want this review back for the worksheet from my account manager when I send this to them? And then it will ask you specifically which transactions you'd like to bill. Right, so this is saying, okay, when I look at those projects, what are we looking for? For time and materials, I want all time and all expenses. This is how this is set by default. But again, if you do pre-bill purchase orders or you need to pre-bill insertion or broadcast orders, you can tell Workamajig to consider those as billable items when it picks this up. These can be filtered, right? So all of the options you see here on the right-hand side for project options, you can say, again, I only want a specific GL company. I only want to create worksheets for a specific account manager, for example. This can make it a little bit more manageable if you have several hundred different worksheets that need to be created to kind of go through them a little bit more intentionally. But again, you don't necessarily need to fill out any of this. One thing I would point out down here is the approver is option. This is one of those areas where the billing manager would come into play. Again, by default, our approver is the account manager, but you can have it be the project manager or the billing manager set for those projects. Any one of those three options will be here. So when I generate or when I search for these worksheets here, it's going to go by the billing method. So kind of similar to what we see in mass billing. And it will show you grouped by client all of the projects that are billable underneath that specific billing method. So for time and materials here, for example, it says, hey, you have 4 different projects for this Workamajig Bootcamp client. Again, it's going to show you the details of your budget, what's been invoiced and what's unbilled currently, and the variance between those two things. I'm going to grab these 4 here and bill them. But again, we also have the fixed fee side. You can also bill campaigns as fixed fee or as a campaign as a whole. A couple different ways to bill these here. But again, fixed fee, kind of a similar idea. It just says, hey, for these clients, these are all the projects that are open and what is to bill for these particular projects. I'm going to grab these ones right here and bill those as well for this same client. And one of the benefits that you have from worksheets outside of just having that back and forth with your account managers, so I go ahead and generate these here, is that you can bill multiple different types billing methods on the same invoice. So using mass billing here, we can't really group time and materials and fixed fee projects for the same clients on the same invoice. Not at least through the mass billing functionality. Those would be kind of one invoice each. With billing worksheets, you can. It just basically says what's everything that's billable across all of the projects for this client here. And if you wanted all those grouped on the same invoice, Workamajig is going to create a master worksheet that allows you to do that. So once you generate these worksheets, Workamajig will notify the users that are the approvers on these worksheets that they have an item to approve that would look actually just like this. They could kind of pop in and take a look at those, and their process would look like this. So this page I'm looking at here right now is really kind of for you or for a finance team member to be able to see all of the worksheets that are out there. It will group it by the approver and then the different clients that have worksheets open for them here. And we can see there's a worksheet for each individual job. So it'll show you for the time and materials worksheets here. They would basically kind of take a look at it through their bill icon, and that would look like this, where it would show them a lot of the information that you've already seen, right? So they can add an invoice comment here that would print to the invoice that is generated from this worksheet. But the work here is largely done on the right-hand side. Workamajig will by default assume that everything up to the date of your worksheet is billable on that project. So whatever worksheet date you set for it, whether it's February 1st or March 1st, all of the transactions prior to that date. And your team can kind of go through this to bill area here to say, okay, yeah, this is all good. Again, we're assuming everything's billable. So the only things I would need to mark or change here are anything that we don't want to bill. Right, so we can say, oh, this first task here, for example, right here, I want that needs to be transferred to another project, or I can say do not bill. It just not bill for this cycle. Again, do not bill does not mean don't bill ever. That just means for this particular billing workflow or this particular billing period, we don't want to bill this transaction. We'll kick it down to the next one here. And under more actions, you can also do things like mark as builds. You can write off the transaction, right? Again, if we're over scope and we can't bill the client for all of these, this is something that you'd want to do. So let's write this one off here. You can set a write-off reason. So we'll say, yeah, this is, beyond scope, for example. I'll go ahead and write that off. Again, I can also transfer transactions. So I can say, oh, this is actually supposed to be on this project. I'll choose that one right there and this task right there, and we'll transfer that as of today here. And a few other options in here. You have things like mark as on hold or mark as on hold billable. Now, I actually recommend not using these. It's pretty easy to lose these transactions if you mark them as hold. They are not billable until you mark them as off of hold again. So to me, it's better to just click do not bill each period. If I don't want to bill this transaction this month or however often you bill, I can have Workamajig just pop it up next time, and if I don't want to bill it then I can click do not bill again. This is a way more intentional way of saying, hey, this is billable but I don't want to bill it this cycle. On hold, you can again make these billable again, but you have to kind of find them intentionally and make them billable. We've done a better job of making those visible on billing worksheets, but I still would recommend kind of making sure that you keep them at the front of your mind when you're going through these processes here. So I'm going to go ahead and close this, and you'll see as we make those changes, right, it'll say, okay, this is the to bill amount. Again, this is kind of primarily what we're looking for here. If there are any transactions that are not on this worksheet from this project or a series of projects associated with this worksheet here, you can add them to it. So this just shows you, hey, we have another $1,700 worth of transactions we could add here. Again, I can just pop into here and grab any one of these if I'd like and say, yep, let's go ahead and add that to the worksheet. It will automatically end up in the to bill area here. And especially for approvers, this other actions area is very important. This says, okay, aside from what we're billing here for this period, these are the other actions that were taken, right? I did write off a transaction, so it shows you that that's the case. And if I needed to undo that, I could undo that here. I did transfer some transactions, and I do also have another 31 grand of billable transactions that I have on other worksheets out there in the system as well. And again, if you use advanced bills here, you can say, hey, this amount should apply to one of these open advanced bills. It will show you I have 10,000 in unapplied advances for this client. So I could say, let's go ahead and auto apply that. So the client's now only owes me $22,000 here, and we'll go ahead and recognize the rest of the revenue for this. Or I could click into the advanced bills here. If I had multiple, I could choose which advanced bill I wanted to apply this to. So as a reviewer, so as the account manager, I could then go ahead and approve this. And this would end up, again, in your billing worksheets workflow. We really only have two statuses for these. Either they're in review or we're ready to create invoices from them. So the design here is that my reviewers, my account managers could kind of look at all of these in mass. They typically want to look at all of them at once and then go ahead and approve them from here. Or from the worksheet itself, but I can mass approve since I'm the approver on all of these. You can as well as an admin, if you're an admin in your system, to kind of work these ways through here. And if we look, it says, okay, now we have some invoices that are ready to create here. I made a number of these. Again, I could have grouped them together on a single invoice if I'd like to, but from here, I can either create invoices for all of them at once, or again, I can go through the worksheets individually and then generate them from here. This will, again, just go ahead and create the invoice from this. So once we generate those here, we kind of take a look at the detail, make sure that's all great here. When we generate that here, again, same option to create these as approved or not. And these then just kind of flow from the billing worksheets area here down to the invoices workflow here, where you can approve them, email them, print them, all of that fun stuff. Okay, so I know we covered quite a bit here today, and we're kind of running up against time, so I want to be respectful of the time for you all. I have a few questions in the chat here I'm going to go ahead and answer. Again, this webinar itself will be uploaded to our support site, so if you need to refer to it, if you need to run now and you want some answers to those questions, you can kind of refer back to them here. If you have additional questions on this or you want some more detail on these processes, I would recommend, encourage you to reach out to your account manager via support@workamajig.com. I'm sure they'll be happy to answer those questions. I'm happy to as well here. Again, I'm going to stay for a couple more minutes here and answer some questions, but I know we're at time. So thank you all for any of you that need to run here. I appreciate you guys popping in here today, and hopefully this was valuable for you. Okay, so I have a couple questions here. For Lindsay, Lindsay asked if there are multiple invoices sent to one client, can I send them in one email from Workamajig? Yes, you can. From the invoices to print or email list here. If I grab multiple of these invoices and I say, oh, I want to go ahead and email these, Workamajig will ask you how you want this to work, right? So you can add a message to the email, and you can also say, okay, you know what, I want one email per contact with multiple attachments. So this is 3 or 4 invoices. I just want the one email with four attachments. Or you could have one email with one attachment, right? This would be now 4 different emails for each one of these. That's kind of here where you'd control that when you actually go to print or email them out of the system. And then I had another question here. Is there a way to change the default to assume everything is not billable so they have to approve items rather than do nothing? By default, I didn't mention this earlier, but for time and materials transactions, we don't allow them to be billed until they've been approved. So as a creative, I can go ahead and enter my time, through my cards or through the timesheet here. But that time itself is not billable until I send it to my approver and they approve it. There are some workflows that allow users to approve their own time if they're set as their own time approver, but most agencies would have a structure that sets up that says, hey, John sends his hours to his approver Susie, and as soon as Susie approves it, those hours are now billable and they will show up in the time and materials area here. But this list only reflects the current approved transactions, and that applies to both time and expenses. If I have vendor invoices in the system, they're not billable until someone's approved them. And then I have another question here from Jennifer that says, when emailing invoices from Workamajig, can you connect it to Outlook so the replies go to your Outlook? There's a couple of different ways that this works, but by default, if you don't have a standard outgoing email set for Workamajig, emails sent from the system by you will come from your email address. It will show that you sent it. So if they reply to those emails, they will come back to you. The only exception to that is if you have access to this area of system setup here, there is a way in Workamajig in your connections to basically say, I want all of my outgoing emails to be the same email address. So this would be something like accounting at your company name, or maybe it's just your finance person's email, something like that. Again, not everybody uses this, and there's nothing set here by default, but that's kind of the only exception to that. They probably wouldn't reply to those if it's a standard email. But in those instances, sometimes those can still feed back to you. But the answer to your question is probably yes, right? Anything you send to a client from Workamajig, they can reply to the email and it would go back to you and back into your Outlook email address or Google or wherever you manage them. Okay. If you guys have any more questions, again, we're probably a couple more minutes here, and then I'll go ahead and wrap this up here. But Lisa had a question. Is it the same if you have Google emails? If the default is not Workamajig, it would be used. Yes. Yeah. So the only thing we care about is if you click on your name here in the upper right-hand corner, this email that's set here. right? We say, okay, when you send emails from Workamajig, whether it's a conversation in a project or it's an invoice, something like that, this is the email that we generate it from. Those emails often generate from our servers, but they will generate using your email address. So if someone responds, it will come back to you. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up here now. Again, if you guys have any additional questions for this, please feel free to reach out to us here in the support team at Workamajig at support@workamajig.com. And I appreciate you guys stopping in. Hope you guys have a great day. Thanks, y'all. Bye-bye.